Good afternoon and welcome to NCIA's Industry Essentials Educational Webinar Series, our premier digital educational platform featuring a variety of interactive programs to provide you timely, engaging, and essential education when and where your team needs it most. My name is Brian Gilbert, the Deputy Director of Events here at National Cannabis Industry Association. And as always, I'm very excited to welcome you all to another edition of our Service Solutions programs being hosted by APPI Energy. One final note for all the guests who are joining us for the live stream on Facebook at the moment, make sure to follow the short link that you see there in the video description to secure a spot in today's session inside the Zoom platform so you don't miss out on all the interactive elements of today's programming. All right, well, now let's get this show on the road. In today's program presented by APPI Energy and entitled Holistic Energy Management Solutions, our dynamic panel of energy experts will take an in-depth look into building out an integrated infrastructure to yield a healthier environment for growth. These experts will walk you through what it means to have a holistic approach to energy management, and you'll leave this webinar with numerous insights into the energy markets, as well as proven technology-agnostic solutions for cannabis businesses. Well, I know our panel is eager to dive into this discussion, and our audience is interested in having their questions answered along the way, so let's not waste any more time. To kick things off, I'd like to welcome our moderator for today's session, Margot Madden from APPI Energy, to the virtual stage to kick things off by introducing our panel of cannabis sustainability experts. Welcome to NCIA's Industry Essentials, Margot. Great to have you here today. You can activate your video feed and take it away from here.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. First, let's start with a little bit about the team you have in front of you today. So we are holistic energy advisors. That means that we are considering energy management from all perspectives to include cost reduction, demand reduction, forecasting, sustainability, resiliency, you name it. We have done a lot of work across the country in this vertical. So collectively, we have provided solutions for over 800,000 square feet of canopy, and we have approximately 1.1 million square feet of canopy in an active pipeline. That encompasses large MSOs that have everything from cultivation to processing to dispensaries, all the way down to small 5,000 square foot boutique operations. We have done work in the horticultural space, greenhouses, indoor grows, and more recently vertical farms for close to 20 years now. We're not going to waste anybody's valuable time with long introductions of each individual. You guys can check out our bios in the link that was attached to the registration page. Moving on to the presentation, I want to frame up that format for you a little bit. Rather than just a straight slide presentation, what we're going to do today is present opportunities and their coinciding solution sets based on our actual experience with your peers. Each section is going to begin with a poll so that we're able to understand the breakdown of the room, and then we'll move into an open panel discussion. Post-presentation, we're going to circulate a short deck so you guys have some follow-up and some reference back on the topics that we reviewed today. All right, let's get started. So we're going to take it first into our first poll question. All right, guys, so when you're planning for a build out or a new grow, how do you work out how much power you're going to need? First, you could extrapolate from an existing grow that you already have. You've already built enough grows, so you've got a standard number in mind. Everybody tells you different numbers, so you take your best guess, or you ask the power company for a big number and you take whatever they can provide. Let's see what we've got. All right, fantastic. So it looks like 70% of the room extrapolates from an existing grow. All right, so you guys use a ton of energy. It's complicated, it's super expensive. And so you want to make sure you have a plan and you're confirming what what energy you need before you start your build out. So Ben, let's discuss building out your energy profile and understanding load requirements. That starts with a comprehensive cultivation strategy. Let's talk about what that means.
Thank you, Margot. I am not surprised by the results from that poll. 70% are using other experiences and to extrapolate from there, because it's really, really difficult to be able to get that number right. So what I'm going to talk about next is how you can do that differently. So rather than just extrapolating, actually go from the fundamentals and calculate how much you need, when you need it, and how much you'll use throughout the year. Many of us probably have experienced this with new builds, or we've been involved in an expansion, perhaps, where time in the cannabis industry moves really, really quickly. We get our license, we're celebrating, cheers, fantastic. We got any, agreements and permits we need in place, and now we got to build. So what we do is we just get some drawings done and we jump straight in. We start ordering long lead item equipment, because in 6 months we've got to be growing. Time is money. And that's where things start to go wrong. Then what happens next is 4 months progress or so. By then we've got contractors on board. We have an electrical guy, a mechanical guy, stuff like that. And we start working out how much is the connected load, how much is all this equipment that we're putting in, how much power can that use? And at that point in time, we start to have a conversation with utility. And that is when the opportunity is lost. And that is when things start to get really, really messy. So our experience has been very, very early on, right up front, even possibly before selecting your site or your building, step back. What's available? What do you need? And come up with a comprehensive operational strategy for your new grow. And as part of that comprehensive strategy, energy is a key component. So what I'm talking about here is, from an energy perspective, what are my requirements going to be? What are the temperatures, the humidities, the VPDs I want to drive? What are the size of my flower rooms? How many? How am I going to stagger them? And all start to get into those details, those requirements that come from your comprehensive strategy. And then from a fundamental perspective, once you know that, you then are in a position to be able to calculate what not only is connected from a power perspective, but what you actually require. So you can now accurately create an energy model. And an energy model is a fundamental component to your pro forma. So like you forecast in your pro forma, price per pound, how much you're going to be getting out the door, et cetera, et cetera. One of the operational items in that's critical is your energy profile. Now that we have an accurate understanding of our energy profile, which means not just how much at any point in time you might need, but how much you will need throughout the year. Now we know what we need and when we need it. Now we're in a position to start having a more robust conversation about what we might be asking for. And at that point in time, it is now to start talking with the utilities. If you left it 4 months into your schedule, that's too late. When we start to talk with the utilities, we need to do it in a very organized way. Our experience with renewable energy projects like fields of solar PV or combined heat and power systems, we've dealt with many, many utilities throughout the country. And, we carry those battle scars. And the world of utility is very, very different to the world that you and I operate in, and most certainly dimensions apart from where a cannabis operator is. Unfortunately, utilities don't have much experience with cannabis operators. And they know about it, they kind of heard about it, they know there's quite a bit of power requirements, but they don't have much experience about, grows going into their network. And, they think back. I had somebody tell me the other day from a utility, it reminds me of the .com bubble, when data centers were just going up everywhere and nobody really knew how much power the data center was really going to need, so everybody started asking for big numbers. And unfortunately, some utilities have had the experience where that's exactly what's happened. A grow operation has asked them for a really, really big number and it never materialized. So in order to avoid those messy conversations, in order to communicate with the utility in a structured and organized way, there's a process that you need to follow. And that starts with a formal request of the utility through a load letter. And that load letter is backed up. And we know what we need because we've already modeled out what we need. So it's backed up with an energy model and it's backed up with supporting information. So when we present that formal request to the utility, we've now communicated that we know what we want, we've communicated that we're organized, and we can now have a sensible conversation about how we can actually progress things to be able to achieve and work out what's available for how much power we need. So,
Ben, thank you. I want to ask Oliver a question about that. And hey, panelists, you guys can all turn on your videos if you haven't done so yet. Oliver, I know that you're talking to clients and prospects all of the time. What's the #1 struggle you've seen with formulating a load profile?
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks, Margot. You know, it's not surprising, as Ben mentioned, that typically they're grabbing usage profiles from other facilities that you're operating at. And I really think one of the biggest problems that cultivators run into is the fact that there's so many different vendors and engineers involved in the build out of the facility, or when you're opening a new facility from scratch. And everyone's really doing their best job, right, to provide you with the amount of energy that you should expect to consume through your individual piece of equipment, whether it be lighting, HVAC, D, or whatever it may be. But until you tie all these components together and how they interrelate within the facility with lighting and HVAC, it's pretty hard to get a good understanding of your overall total power burn. So I think usually what happens is there's so many people that are involved in the project that when you're looking at your overall profile, it's hard to formulate. But as Ben mentioned, putting this together ahead of time is so important. So one, you are getting your load letters off to your utility, so you can understand the power requirements from day one. Two, you can then analyze it from a phase of development standpoint. So if you've got 3 phases of development and your power is going to increase as time progresses, why would you not address this at the beginning of operations rather than waiting and having to delay operations and delay the power that you require? So from that perspective, it's so important. And from another perspective, which is often overlooked, if you understand your total load profile through your current phase, but also through several different phases, and roughly what your energy cost is going to look like, that's a great way to put together an understanding of what your financials are going to look like, in a year's time and in 2 years' time. So it enables you to, have a firmer grip of your financials as you progress through each phase of development. And that's typically what we see. It's just there's so many people involved. It's hard to bring everyone together to get that overall profile and what that looks like from a total burn or standpoint.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. And I know, we were talking to a cultivator last week, Ben, who had their build out, they had bought equipment, they were ready to expand. And now we're so bumped up against a timeline that they're not sure that they're going to be able to meet their deadline. So we're seeing that a lot as well.
It happens all the time, Margot, unfortunately. The example you mentioned, the conversation is now about renting megawatts and megawatts of backup power to be able to get into production. And that could have been avoided, unfortunately. And remember that the psychology of a utility is very different to the psychology that you and I might operate under, and that a lot of growers expect that the utility would operate under. And the world of a utility is very regulated. It's very structured. Things move slowly. And if you if you don't appreciate that and you don't approach this up front and very structured in how you handle the conversation, often what we see is utilities will just stand back and wait and see what's going to happen. And the example Oliver gave, it's all very well taking a 2,000 square foot of canopy and seeing how much kilowatt hours that is per square foot, and then extrapolating it to 100,000 of canopy. But that's a big, big number. And that can be out by a factor of up to 50 times. So you need to be very, very careful. And that's why we always stress back to fundamentals, understanding HVAC, lighting, all those fundamentals that come from your requirements and come ultimately from your comprehensive strategy. So yeah, I hope that, if there's any attendees on the session here and they're thinking about this, and I'm hoping that they will trigger them to get started with this sooner rather than later.
Great. Thanks, Ben. So, all right, now we've got our load profile. We know we can secure enough power from the utility. Let's talk about sourcing that power at the best price. But before we do that, let's jump into our next poll question. All right, guys, when it comes to energy, what is the most important factor to you? Is it lowest price, budget certainty, reliability, sustainability, or capacity? Reliability. Okay. Interesting. All right, great. So Dan, it looks like reliability comes in here with 44%. Next is sustainability, which we know is a really big deal, especially in this vertical. We're seeing that a lot. So Dan, I know there's a ton of different procurement strategies out there around pricing and products and taxing. Tell us a little bit about electric and natural gas procurement. Let's start big picture and maybe hone in for us.
Sure. Happy to do that. And good afternoon, everybody. So it's interesting, Margot, that, the results that we saw oftentimes when we're talking to folks in deregulated markets, that's where they have a choice in their provider of electricity or natural gas. Price does become more of an important factor. Although a lot of folks in a regulated market, you really don't have a lot of option around price. You're probably straight with the utility, and you kind of open the bill at the end of the month and hope that it's not too painful. But from a bigger standpoint, about 14 states within the US have deregulated or re-regulated their electricity markets. About 25 have re-regulated their natural gas markets. I say re-regulated versus deregulated because there's still regulation. There's still rules in place that the competitive suppliers have to comply with. But basically what that works out to be in a deregulated market is you have kind of two components. You have the supply of the electricity or the natural gas, and then you have the local distribution. We don't run wires down every street. We don't run pipelines down every street. But in a deregulated market, in those 14 states we mentioned, you can really have competitive suppliers compete for your business. And one of the things we like to try to do is have them compete on a level playing field, whether, again, that's for electricity or natural gas. Within that broad category of supply, the energy itself and the distribution continues to be regulated by the individual state. But again, competition really comes in on the supply side. Within that, a lot of folks just say, hey, I'm paying 8 cents a kilowatt hour, 5 cents a kilowatt hour. That's my price. However, within that, if you really break it down a little bit more, there's a number of cost components that actually make up that price. That might be the energy itself. That might be the high voltage transmission, something known as capacity, renewable portfolio standards, a lot of different things that make up that price. When we start talking about procurement strategies, Margot, we can really help clients understand, does it make sense to lock in all those cost components? Do we want to lock in some of them in a fixed price and float some of the others? Do we want to take more of an actively managed approach? Or do we want to just float all those out on the wholesale market? Oliver, that reminds me of a little bit of a conversation we had probably just in the last 2 weeks for one of our clients in Maryland, where we were talking a little bit about the pros and cons of locking in some of those components and floating some of those. You want to delve into that a little bit more, Oliver, on that scenario?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. All really good points. I think the overall message to kind of hammer back is to know your state and know your market, right? As Dan mentioned, there's a number of states that are deregulated for electric and natural gas procurement, but there's also a number of states where you can't negotiate that supply cost. And just like cannabis laws and regulations differ, from state to state, it's the exact same way for energy. So there's many different things that go into your overall energy costs that's going to affect your rate. So again, it's just important to understand what your capabilities are in each market that you have a facility operating in. What can you procure, what can you negotiate, and what can you control? If you're in a deregulated market, you should absolutely be exploring, the different opportunities that are available to you to best position your facility. And as Dan mentions, there's many different components, right, that make up your overall fixed energy price. And quite often from market to market, whether or not you're going to lock in and fix a portion of those components or let them float on an index is largely dictated by the state you operate in. So a lot of that also then turns down to your risk appetite. Right? You can fix all components, set it and forget it, have a rate which is set for 4 years and it never changes. But often in some markets, dependent on the utility and if they're competitive or not versus competitive supply, it can often make sense to move over, as Dan mentioned, to an active managed portfolio product, whereby it's not one rate for the duration of the term. So you're looking at those cost components. The primary one, which we all think of top of mind, is the commodity price itself, right? The energy cost. But there's capacity, transmission, R&R, line losses, and in certain circumstances, it makes sense to pass those through at cost rather than fixing them. For a competitive,
I'm going to stop you right there for a minute, because I mean, if you're not in energy, all of that is like right over your head. It's super, super complicated. So guys, this is why we are recommending that you work with an energy manager, right? You need to work with an expert that is doing this every day, that can help guide you and facilitate those conversations, because there's so many components that play a part in it. And you're not expected to be an expert in energy or in every different state that you operate in. And that's where, an organization like APPI, we can help you be an extension of your team. Yeah,
that's right. And one other point to tie in there, it's not just the components, but market timing, right? So the energy market's like a stock market. It goes up and down every single day, and you can take a bad position as you could make a bad investment. So, not only is it understanding those cost components, but it's understanding the fundamentals of the market and when is the appropriate time to buy and when is the appropriate time to potentially hold. So yeah, having someone on your team or working with a consultant is crucial in understanding those different dynamics.
That's awesome. Thanks, Oliver. So Dan, it gets pretty complicated. I know we've got a couple other factors in here we want to touch on before we get to more of the fun stuff. Let's talk about rate, class evaluation, and tax exemption.
Sure. No, that's a great point, Margot. And really the good news is obviously NCIA is a national organization. Again, only about 14, 15 states are deregulated for electricity. The good news is, though, even in a regulated state, a traditional utility monopoly structure, you still do have some options, and we can help you evaluate some options to try to reduce your costs. Again, those continue to be set by the state and approved by the state. But your rate class can actually really vary, what your actual final cost is. So a good example, and again, this gets a little into the weeds, but something known as a time of use as a rate class, as opposed to an around the clock. Obviously, in the cultivation space, you folks are using energy days, nights, weekends, weekdays. It may benefit you to take advantage of those off-peak hours and off-peak rates, because so much of your usage does come off-peak. So a good example there, not actually in the cannabis space, but in the agricultural commodity space, a company that had locations in deregulated markets, as well as some behind what's known as a cooperative or a local regional utility, which are normally not open to competition. but they came to us and said, hey, we've got this other location. I know you guys can't really help us on the supply side, but the utility has come to us and saying, do you want a time of use rate class, or do you want just a summary bill? Well, we'll bill you at the end of the month. We did a pretty in-depth analysis for them to really determine that time of use was really much to their advantage. Really doesn't make a whole lot of difference to the utility what you choose. They're not really in it in the same way as these competitive suppliers. They're going to get pretty much a guaranteed rate of return. But to the client, it was a pretty significant difference, somewhere in the area of $50,000, $60,000 a year, that the one rate class was quite a bit more advantageous. Tax exemptions kind of work the same way. It varies by state. But generally, if the energy is an integral part of your process, which I suspect in most states that would qualify for most of the folks on the call here, you can actually be tax exempt for the energy or that percentage of the energy that goes into your final product, if you will. So generally that starts with a study where we come at predominant use study is known as, where we come in and actually think, okay, 70% of the energy is going to the final product. 30% is keeping the office, whatever that is, keeping that cool. Can't qualify necessarily for the 30%, but boy, 70% of your energy expense is actually tax exempt. Oftentimes we do come across, I'm sorry, Margo, real quick one more. We come across folks who have been paying taxes inadvertently or by mistake. Oftentimes our customer service team can actually go and get you rebates as far as 3 or 4 years back in arrears and recoup some of those dollars. So can be some really significant dollars just around rate class and around tax exemption. Didn't mean to cut you off there, Margo.
No, perfect, Dan. That's actually exactly where I was going. Oliver and I were just speaking with someone who, we were taking a look at their bill. We noticed they were paying taxes, and we're going to be able to go back and see, how much they've paid, and are we able to help them recoup some of those dollars. So fantastic. Thank you. So if we go back to our poll, it looked like reliability was the #1 answer, and we're going to get to that a little bit later in the presentation. But the #2 answer was sustainability. And so I want to loop in renewable energy certificate procurement, because that's something we've been seeing, an increase in ask around procuring renewable energy. So Dan, I'm going to hand it back to you for a minute. Can you explain what a REC is and how that process works?
Sure. No, I was pleased to see that as the #2 result there, Margo. And again, this is something we can help across the country, whether it's a regulated or a deregulated market. We can help folks procure not necessarily the electrons from a wind farm or from a solar panel, but the property rights. And basically, a REC, a renewable energy certificate, gives you those property rights to the environmental or the social attributes of green power. The way that it works is you basically add that on in addition to your quote unquote brown power. But again, you can do that in any market. And then a third party will actually verify somewhere on the grid, the energy to power your facility has been put on the grid, and they verify that can only be counted once. So you can then, what we often see is that, folks, whether it's maybe their supply chain is pushing them to be more towards sustainability, their own corporate goals are pushing them in that direction. But the idea of then marketing themselves as, 50% of our power comes from green sources, 100% of our power is from green. Even so much to this, the fact that you can become an EPA green partner if a certain percentage of your power comes from renewable sources. So we're really seeing that not only in the tech sector and manufacturing, certainly in the cannabis space as well. Oliver, I think you and I were just able to put one of your clients in a package that basically was able to green up, so to speak, their entire load for a pretty insignificant cost premium. Chat about that a little bit, Oliver.
Yeah, that's right. I think a lot of cultivators or end users don't actually use understand the accessibility to RECs and how easy it is to add on to a supply agreement and the nominal cost difference there is to do so. So I mean, typically it's about 0.3 of a penny, so three mils to add rec procured energy to a supply agreement or to a typical utility expense compared to brown power. So it's not a substantial, increase to your overall cost, but, then you have the ability to turn it around, as Dan mentioned, and turn that into a marketing piece to market that you're procuring rec energy and you're supporting, renewably sourced energy, which I think from a consumer perspective, particularly with this industry, is very important to them. And quite often, rec procurement can bridge the gap to potentially a longer term sustainable strategy. As Ben and Chris talk later, there's ways to generate energy alternatively from renewable sources or more efficiently. And sometimes that can take, 6 months, a year, 2 years to actually hammer out and get everything flowing and running. So this, rec procurement is a phenomenal way to bridge that gap to your longer term sustainability goals. Another thing I'll just tie in here real quick, outside of rec procurement, is the development of community solar over, the last couple of years. I mean, it's been, there's new community solar projects popping up everywhere. And, we've been very successful in monitoring them and connecting clients to them. So, on top of rec procurement, you can be tied to a specific community solar project. And that's another way to, work towards sustainable goals with limited capital, investment up front. So yeah, it's just, we use a ton of energy in this industry, and anything that we can do and help our clients do to become more sustainable and efficient is top priority for us. So.
And Oliver, I'll throw one more in, and we'll turn it back to you, Margot. But the idea of carbon offsets, folks are hearing more and more about it. And let's fight greenhouse gases. Certainly, we're seeing that at the national level with the new administration. But we have a lot of organizations who are interested in doing that as well. And it can work very similar to the REC program, as Oliver mentioned. Pretty easy, straightforward process, minimal cost difference. You can feel a little better about taking care of the planet going forward as well. So I'll turn that back over to you, Margot.
Great. Thanks, Dan. So, all right, guys, we've got our plan. We've got our forecast. We've secured enough power from the utilities at the right price. Now we are inside the grow, and this is a tricky space, right? So, whether it's too much humidity or too much temperature, cooling, heating, or a need for integrated controls and lighting, inconsistent grows are an issue. So let's turn it over and see what the room thinks and see what our next poll question is. All right, guys. So what are your top challenges from the standpoint of maintaining a consistent grow environment? Is it humidity, temperature, not enough light, inadequate controls, or lack of data or information? All right, lack of data or information comes in first there. Not surprising. And then we're sort of all over the board there. All right, so Ben, I mean, inside this grow has been your life for quite some time now. And we've seen organizations simply throw equipment at their problems. And again, it's costly, it's time consuming, trying to fix or Band-Aid. So let's get into it. Can you talk to us about some of these solutions in the controls and HVAC space?
Well, it's great that you recognize I have a life, Margot, which is fantastic. But I bet you on the poll, everybody wanted to choose 2 or 3 or 4 of the radio buttons, right? And they were forced to choose one. So remember we spoke about standing back, having a comprehensive plan, a comprehensive strategy, and going from there down. So that's critical, right? So remember that the cannabis plant is an incredibly complex plant. As a matter of fact, many people say it is the most complex plant out in the world of plants. So you hear all sorts of lingo and things. You hear the word strain, for example, which I think is the wrong word to use. You hear cultivars. You hear all these sorts of things. The reality is this plant has been propagated all around the world and has been subjected to all sorts of different environments. And what happens when you take a cultivar, which is selected out of a family, and you put that cultivar in an environment, the impact of the environment on the plant does many things. Is the leaf narrow? Is it broad? Well, if it's narrow, it's probably from the tropics. If it's broad, it's probably from, a bit further north or south. And that affects, that's one example. There's many other impacts on the plant. So when those environmental impacts are placed upon the cultivar, that's when you have phenotypes. And phenotypes are a desired outcome. And you pair that with the chemovar, which is the human need of the chemical response that you want for that particular product. More CBD, more whatever it might be. So now what we do is we take this cultivar and we go and stick it in an environment that we have created. It's no longer outside. And we expect that the plant is going to respond just like it did outside, but it doesn't. And we're confused why. And it's because when we take that cultivar and we put it in an environment that we have under our control, we really need to control that environment properly. So, that's why, the way I see it is the poll questions is everybody's kind of got a problem with everything maybe, and they don't really know what is the exact problem because everything is all sort of balanced off against one another. It's complicated. So firstly, we're talking about indoor grows. So you have a glass house, you have an open glass house. An open glass house is very different to an indoor grow. An open glass house has air coming in from outside, goes through the glass house, there's supplemental heating, cooling, additional light. You're tweaking what's available from the environment. Then you take a closed glass house where you bottle that all up. Yes, you have sun coming in, so you have less light, but you still have a closed environment. Then you take that indoors, and now you're in control of your entire destiny. And it is critical to understand the fundamentals in order to create an environment that cultivar is expecting. An environment that is consistent, an environment that delivers what is required in week 2 and what is required in week 8 or 9. What happens when the lights turn off? It's got to be consistent, not only from week to week to week, it needs to be consistent from lights on to lights off. We literally have seen some grow rooms that unfortunately, humidity swings are 10+%. No cannabis plant likes it. As a matter of fact, hardly any plant likes that. So if you're swinging the humidity by 10% every night, that creates other issues in addition to an unhappy plant. It encourages the growth of mold and powdery mildew and items like that, and things get really humid when you flick the lights off. So what you first need to do is to start with your requirements from your comprehensive plan. You know what your temperatures are, you know what your humidity is. Everybody has agreed what that's going to be in week 2 with the lights on. Is it the same when the lights are off? What is it going to be through the grow? At least at 4 points throughout there. And from there, understand what your vapor pressure deficit is. So one of the big problems is when you take all these plants and you put them inside a closed environment, you don't have the benefit of this huge big atmosphere that we've got to remove the transpiration and be very consistent. So you remember, high school biology, you have PPFD, you have light shining on the leaves, there's water that gets taken up with nutrients, there's all the sugars and the plant is growing and it's taking in CO2. But it needs to be able to transpire and release that moisture so it can take more moisture out and grow. And if you don't fundamentally address that and remove that moisture at a rate that is optimal for that cultivar, you're not going to get the desired results you want. So fundamentally understand, your lighting, how much CO2 are you putting in? Are you injecting CO2 during lights on and lights off, or just lights on when you're growing? Temperature, humidity, CO2, right? Then there's a whole nother world of how often do you water, what the nutrients looks like, the media, all that sort of stuff. So those requirements dictate the design of the HVACD, the heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and dehumidification system that is required to remove that transpiration, so you can successfully deliver the VPDs that you want and the consistency that you want. So, you know, like when you flick those lights off, right, the cannabis plant needs to have lights on and lights off. It needs sunlight and it needs time to rest. Unlike leafy greens, lettuces, whatever, they can grow all the time. You know, you can have lights on near 24/7. The cannabis plant needs to sleep. When you flick those lights off, it doesn't get the message that it's now time to stop transpiring. So it continues to transpire. But hey, by the way, when you turn the lights off, all of a sudden there was a ton of heat that was being put into the room that the HVAC was cooling, removed. So when you sunset the lights, all that heat is being removed. So the HVAC stops dehumidifying, because the dehumidification comes as a byproduct of the cooling, normally in most typical HVAC systems. And that's when you get all these humidity problems and inconsistencies.
So in terms of managing all of that data, it seems like, you know, we've got to get a good handle on that, because, you know, our number one answer was lack of data or information, right? So what do we do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've heard many times about growers who've had a problem where they switched to LED lights and they were terrible. They didn't deliver, you know, the results they wanted. And 9 times out of 10, it was nothing to do with the lights. It was all to do with the heat and all to do with the HVAC. So in order to get that data, I mean, ultimately, we want to control the HVAC system with a control system that is designed appropriately to match the HVAC and match the requirements. And it's programmed into the system, it's commissioned, it's tweaked, and it's running appropriately. But if we don't have that, we don't have sense, we don't know what's going on, we need to start taking readings. We have to get portable tools. We have to go and take, you know, put down a logger across a week or so, or maybe across, you know, the whole flowering cycle. See what happens, you know, see what happens just in that period after the lights are turned off, and collect that data. And then that will really help us understand exactly what's happening inside that room. So that's one way to grab the data.
Great. Now, Oliver, I know, you know, you've had some experience on the data management side, and it hasn't necessarily been, you know, to make sure you're getting all your set points correct, but there's other things that you can do with that data. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a couple ways to look at it, right? You can look at it from a very high up perspective, where you're looking to track whether it be just your pure commodities, right, or electricity, gas, water, waste. So, you know, there's different data management and platforms out there to help you consolidate that into all you know, into one location, whether it's for upper management to have, you know, a view of one facility, or you're managing, you know, multiple facilities and you want to have one central point where you can click and access a visibility of your entire portfolio. So there's lots of different tools that you can do to track that. And from there, you can dial in even further and do, you know, behind the meter controls to monitor individual pieces of equipment. If you are struggling, you know, with a particular point. And I think ultimately where these systems can become very important in terms of controls is if you're having the issues, it can help spot anomalies if you have controls to actually identify, you know, what's going on. So, you know, there's many different platforms and controls that you can implement. It just depends on what you want to see, whether or not you're looking for just a total facility management perspective or homing into individual pieces of equipment. So it's just, once you've identified a problem, it's really speaking to someone to help implement a solution, which is going to lead to a solution.
Yeah, and I know, Oliver, you had mentioned in certain states there's, you know, starting to be benchmarking, right? You've got to meet certain requirements.
Yeah, that's right. Great point. You know, I think Massachusetts and Illinois are the 2 states right now which have heavy compliance laws, or that they're setting, you know, the energy guidelines and so forth. In Massachusetts, it's 36 watts per square feet. So how are you going to track that? You know, I mean, you could get out your pen and paper, or you could put in some controls to help do it and automate it. And in particular with that as well, you also have Power Score, where you're having to upload different pieces of information. So as the industry evolves and more states and potentially even federally, right, different energy guidelines are implemented, these different control systems, one, are going to help you maintain a perfect internal environment, but two, help you track, monitor data, identify anomalies, and also report data to whoever it may be, whether it's your corporate or to some sort of control commission that's managing that particular state.
Awesome. Thanks, Oliver. So, all right, guys, let's bring it back, bigger picture, and let's get into some of the fun stuff. Let's talk about on-site generation. So let's bring up that last poll we have. All right, guys, have you considered generating your own power? You've already considered it. You've considered it, but decided against it. It's time to think about it, or been there, done that. Great. That's what I expected to see. It's time to think about it. So guys, whether you've considered it and decided against, or, it's time to think about it. It looks like we didn't get any answers about been there, done that. So that's really cool. Chris, let's start with CHP. Let's talk about, one of the oldest ways to generate power.
Yeah, sure. Hi, good afternoon to everybody. I'm actually going to ask Professor Samways, as we affectionately call him, to start off. He's going to give you he's got a good knack of being able to take a complicated solution and make it very simple. So Ben, why don't you kick off with a kind of a definition of CHP, and then I'm going to talk about applications for prime power, backup power, and so forth.
Yep, sure, Chris, no problem. So combined heat and power is exactly that, right? You are making both power, electricity, and heat at the same time. The heat can be in the form of heat, but heat can also be turned into cooling. So it can do combined heating, cooling, and power. So the electric grid in the United States is about, low 30s, maybe mid 30s efficiency. And it's because when there's a power station far away from where you're using your electricity, it's taking in a fuel source and it's combusting that, and it's making some electricity, and that electron is finally making its way all the way over to you where you're using it, and there's some efficiency losses along the way. But hey, when you combusted that molecule of energy at the power station, like close to 2/3 of it went up the stack, went out, whether it's a natural gas or whether it's coal or whatever. It's going up the stack, and that heat is being wasted. So if you take that and you take that molecule to where you're growing and where you're using your energy, and you actually combust it or have it in an engine or something like that and make your own power, you now have the ability to use that heat for something useful. So that means you can take that heat and make hot water, and the hot water can go over to your HVAC or your radiant slab in your greenhouse or whatever, or it can be sent into a special chiller, and the special chiller takes the heat and makes cooling, and that cool chilled water can go out to your HVAC to cool things down. Hey, you need heating and cooling when you dehumidify in an indoor grow, so fantastic. Where CHP really works well is where you need both power and heating or cooling at the same time, right? Well, when the lights are on, you need tons of power for your lights, and you need heating and cooling at the same time, right, for the temperature and humidity control, so tech. The other place where combined heat and power works really well is where there's a relative arbitrage between the cost of the fuel input to the CHP and the cost of your electrical power that the CHP is making. So it's not uncommon in many parts of the US to have, an arbitrage, factors of 20 or something like that. Like 1 MMBTU of electricity costs way more than 1 MMBTU of natural gas, if natural gas is being used in the CHP. So where there's that gap, that spark spread, is where there's a relative, efficiency cost that you can play between the price of power which you're generating, which you no longer need to buy off the grid, versus a much cheaper cost of natural gas going. And hey, I mentioned 30% efficient off the grid. Chris, when you make your own power and you can use your heat, it's at least 60%, 70, 80. You know, we have some sites clocking 90% efficiency because you can use that heat.
Exactly. All right. So as advertised, Professor Samways did a great job of explaining the technology, its outputs, and its application. I'm going to kind of bring it to a practical level where, you know, in the past, and there's gigawatts of combined heat and power installed in the United States in heavy energy usage environments where there's a heating and cooling thermal load. So think data centers, think hospitals, think universities, and so forth. It used to be all about cost savings, right? It used to be about using CHP on premise, being your own power and thermal generator, and really significantly saving on cost, as been described through gas and electricity. But, you know, we've got another phenomenon that we mentioned earlier in the panel session, and that is how quickly can you get enough power from the utility to provide for the needs that you have? And so is it a cost savings consideration? Yes. But is it a capacity discussion? Absolutely. Because you may be sitting for a while waiting to get enough energy from the utility to actually provide for the expansion goals that you have and the different phases. So, you know, from a prime power perspective, very proven, very cost effective, but also a great way to add power capacity sooner versus later. And then, you know, we talk a little bit about resiliency earlier. The poll, you know, indicated that. Well, I guess the good news with combined heat and power is you kind of get your cake and you get your icing, in the sense that if designed right, that same engine, that same system that's running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, can be configured to actually be your backup power as well. So if the grid goes down because of, depending on where you are in the country, rolling blackouts, rolling brownouts, natural weather events like we've seen so many of lately, you know, the same system that's producing your everyday energy can actually be configured to be set up for backup power as well. And that resiliency is so important because you've got critical plants to look after, and they don't do well with hiccups. As you become more automated, as you have more controls, the need for consistent energy is there as well, right? Can't have hiccups in those energy intensive systems. So really good, interesting application there. I'm going to switch gears to solar and battery storage for a minute. I think that most of you have probably either seen solar systems, maybe implemented solar at your homes, have seen it in public sector installations. Solar is on a absolute accelerated incline, and right along with it is battery storage. Applications for solar at your site, you know, can include rooftop solar installations. They can include ground that you might have available, land that's surrounding your site, or even parking canopy. The idea here is to, again, control somewhat of your destiny with on-premise generation. And when you generate a kilowatt hour of energy on-premise, you can attack both the energy cost that you're paying from a supplier, but in many cases, depending on the location and utility tariff, you can start impacting the demand side of your bill. We don't have time to get into it completely today, but let's just say that probably none of you are surprised to see the demand side of your energy expenses go up more than the supply side. Supply has been relatively stable. Demand is outpacing supply. We have recent examples, for example, in California, where modeling solar and storage for a client moving to an implementation could save them of $1 million annual expense, roughly $250,000 by solar energy alone. But when you add battery to that, to take in that energy and provide energy during the highest cost peaks during the day, it could lower that bill by another $500,000, right? So in combination, 75% savings by using both solar and battery storage. So it links back to the resiliency goal. It links to the sustainability goal that Oliver and Dan talked about. And it's a great time to think about these. So Margot, being sensitive to time, I'm going to turn it back to you, and we probably have some Q&A coming up.
Yeah, guys. So thank you so much. I think we'll go around we're bumping up right against the hour here. Any last thoughts from anyone?
I would just have one quick one here, just to piggyback off Chris. You know, once you have these different energy storage solutions or applications in place, it can quite often enable you to participate in demand response programs.
Yeah.
Whereby if you don't have this backup power to curtail your energy when called upon, you know, as a cultivator, you can't do it. You can't just turn off your power and you know, say good luck to the plants. So, you know, with these sort of applications, it actually enables you to participate in demand response programs, which Chris mentioned can have substantial financial benefits to it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Margot, we've all said this in different ways throughout the course of today's panel session, and I thank everybody for participating on the attendee side and for our great esteemed panelists. You know, at the end of the day, it's a very tricky environment that you're managing. And, you know, as we like to say with our clients in the space, very good temperature controlled, consistent grow environments yield happy bud, and happy bud yields happy clients and a high price. So the good news is there's a lot of experts to help. It could be daunting. You know, mistakes can be made in throwing equipment at problems, but when we take a step back and take a look at it, you know, like any problem, there are solutions, and they're happening today in the business. So I thank everybody and just encourage you to look in deeper.
Great. All right. Thanks, guys. So let's jump over to the Q&A.
Sure.
There's one question there, Margot, around states and solar and incentives.
Yes.
Yeah, let me
about that, Chris.
jump in on that. Sure. So you know, there are ever-changing incentives at the state level, and they change radically and they change often. Some of the highest value incentive states for solar include California, particularly because with solar you can change the tariff of the electric rate that you're on. Massachusetts is a very pro-incentive solar state. New Jersey is a remarkable incentive solar state. And then we have a whole host of, you know, of other states where solar is now working either on premise or in a community format that Oliver mentioned, because enough incentives exist. So that would be, you know, Maryland as a good example, Virginia, there's programs in Illinois. And so, you know, most of them are now getting to a level where the incentives exist to make an on-premise solution work. There's some states still that are laggards that have not come around and have not allowed for on-premise solar, but they're few and they're getting less and less by the quarter.
Great. Thank you, Chris. We've got another one, Oliver. This is probably Oliver or Dan. It says, my building isn't built yet. Can I look at better energy pricing now?
Yeah, absolutely is a question of that. And I think a key component of that is, do you have a built out energy model? You know, suppliers are willing to entertain bids on future contracts based off future loads, as long as you have a detailed load profile built out. So the answer to that question is yeah. And in where that can be advantageous as well is the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, the market changes every day. So if you've got a facility that is potentially going live in 2020 and the market's in a favorable position, then absolutely, if you have that load profile built out, you can go to market and have suppliers bid on future contracts today for a future start date that might not even, your contract might not even come to fruition until June 2022. So yeah, you can do that, but as I sort of reiterate, you have to have that detailed load profile built out for them to entertain the bid.
And thanks, Oliver. Dan, we've got a lot of experience with this. I mean, we've done this a lot over the past few years.
Yeah, energy's a little, as Oliver mentioned, energy's a little different. Most things in life, you wait till you pretty much run out and then you go to the store and you buy it. Energy is a little different in that you can secure it today and say, I don't deliver it until starting next January or the May of 2024. So this idea of a futures pricing, I can lock in today's preferable energy market conditions, but don't deliver it till some point in the future. And for folks that are under, maybe in this case, haven't built their facility yet, but we can certainly help them there. Or they're under contract in those deregulated states and say, hey, call me, my contract goes for another year and a half, call me in a year and a half. We would often say, hey, let's just take a look now, maybe not buy right now, but let's just take a look at what the market is at this point. Maybe it makes sense to do at this point, lock in now. Maybe we monitor the market for you and help you establish a strike price, or maybe you do wait till conditions are a little bit more favorable. The idea, though, as the start date gets closer, we know volatility increases, much more dependent on the weather. So we like to get out ahead of it and help you buy on the inevitable dips in the market.
Yeah, Dan, I think the overall message there is just being proactive, right?
Absolutely. Great. Yep. Well said.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So we got another one. Let's see. That says, it was about.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions in the chat as well, Margot.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for. A couple. There was a question about funding. How do we get funding?
Sure. Yeah, there's that, and there's also a question which is sort of linked to that, and it's around the energy modeling and system design affect the first cost of equipment. So why don't I tackle that one first, and then we can all touch on funding. The funding one is a very open-ended question. So the reality is if you energy model and you understand what you require, that does a number of things. Firstly, it allows you to appropriately size and design your system to deliver the requirements that you need. So unlike many industries, the requirements are so important because the value of the product is so high that what comes first is being able to have a great yield and a great quality, right? So you've got to get that right. But what it does is it also confirms what you need, so you don't end up overspending upfront from a capital perspective, because people are so concerned about all these problems that they hear. So well, let's just double it, and all these sorts of things happen. So you can avoid that. You can put the appropriate system at the appropriate first cost. But hey, by the way, by designing it appropriately upfront, you can actually save a hell of a lot of your operating cost. And I'm talking about like 40% on your energy if you design your HVAC, air handling and stuff appropriately. It makes a huge difference. And you'll also get the cake as well, because you're also going to have appropriate control to meet your requirements, right? So it helps on both the front end and the back end. And if you are able to go through that process and justify that, there are many incentives available from the utilities that they are desperate to put to work for appropriate design facilities that are, going to use a lot of energy, and they really don't want them to be energy hogs. So you now have access to incentives. But it also allows you to justify the funding of your equipment over a longer period of time. If you have an efficient grow, right, it's all about your long-term operating costs. Your labor costs are very high, but your energy costs are very, very high too. And if you can affect that, that really makes a significant difference to your profitability and the value of your business. And remember that unfortunately in the cannabis industry, right, there's 280E restrictions, there's all sorts of things that we could talk about for a good hour or so alone, but cannabis businesses get taxed 50 to 80% more than a normal commercial and industrial business. So like every penny counts, because you're going to lose at least half of it anyway. So from a funding perspective, it's all about the situation. So if it's a new co-startup, right, that's not going to only be a debt type arrangement. That's going to be some form of equity, possibly some convertible debt in there, because that's a new company. It doesn't have a track record, right? If it's an existing entity that does have a track record, it's possibly building out their cultivation, expanding interstate. There's different ways to do that. And considering structures under which you optimize your ability to not be grossly penalized from a tax perspective, yet you get to take on debt, and yet you get to take your interest as an expense, then you haven't given away a huge chunk of equity just so you can get that build out, interstate, or expansion done. So I hope that that helps share some color to the the question from in the chat there, Margo.
Yeah. Hey, Ben, I'd add to that. I agree with everything you said. A couple other dimensions to it. I am a self-proclaimed finance geek, so I'll admit that. There are significant tax benefits to many of the solutions that we work with. And I'm talking about benefits that accrue to the owner of those assets, investment tax credits, depreciation. So one of the very first things that we talk to clients in your industry about is what is their current ability to monetize these tax benefits. And if the corporate structure is not set up that way, there are some pretty simple ways that we can advise to help you get it set up so that you can monetize those tax benefits. The second thing is there's often a lot of latent value in the infrastructure and the property and the site that you have that we can talk about. How do you leverage that? And then, as Ben said, just to reiterate, depending on where you are in your company's maturity as it relates to cash flow, profitability, startup, there's different levels of capital for different levels of risk. And those are conversations that we do and often have, and have provided many millions of financing in this space. So happy to have those conversations with you.
All right, great. Guys, I think that wraps it up for our Q&A. So I want to thank all of the attendees today for coming. Thank all of the panelists for joining. I think that was a really productive conversation. Brian at NCIA, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Wow, fantastic. I think that of all the service solution sessions that we've hosted over the last year, that was by far the most engaging and interactive. So I really appreciate you all taking it to the next level for all of our audience members today, and Margo, to you specifically for leading these experts through a very complicated subject, but you were able to bring it down and talk to everybody here on their level and really give some useful tips to take away from this. And I really appreciate all the audience members as well for engaging in the back and forth inside the chat room, as well as the Q&A board. So thank you as well to everyone for participating in today's session. If you enjoyed today's session, please give us some feedback on that outro poll that we just enabled, and we'll share the results before we leave. And then also, if you enjoyed today's session, please give some feedback to our panelists by raising your hand in the audience poll so we can see these awesome pop-up windows come up, and post what your best takeaway from today's fantastic program is inside the chat room. Follow Mary's example right there. Fantastic. Well, as always, we're going to close out today's session by giving you all a quick preview of some upcoming sessions underneath the Industry Essentials webinar program that we'd love all of your all's participation in, while also sharing contact information so that you all can follow up with any of these amazing expert panelists directly. I know there were a number of questions that people were sending, specifically direct messaging to the panelists throughout the session as well. So please do not hesitate to log this information. As always, do note that you'll be sent a PDF of today's slide deck for reference so that you can utilize and reference all the amazing information that the panel discussed, as well as utilize the contact information that you all see here for any additional follow-up. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the hour, we are going to continue the conversation inside of the Slack channel and leave the Slack channel open for the next 72 hours. So a few things to take note there. After today's program wraps, check your inbox. If you did not receive an invitation from feedback@slack.com with the subject line, Brian Gilbert has invited you to a workspace, then please do reach out to NCIA directly. You can just reply to any of the confirmation emails that you have surrounding your participation with today's webinar, and we'll make sure that you can get inside the channel and make the most out of your participation there over the next few days. If you are already inside the Slack channel, do feel free to carry on the conversation, post any questions that you might not have gotten answered today during the session inside the general chat room, and we'll pick up the conversation where we left off. And then at the end, do take note of any of those resource files that are pinned inside of the file section of the Slack channel. And then last but not least, do make sure to browse the virtual roster for today's event by heading into the people section inside the Slack channel. You can open up anybody else's profile, log their contact information, and then also direct message or even conference call directly within the Slack channel itself. All right. And with that, thank you all so much for participating in another NCIA Industry Essentials educational webinar. A huge thank you once again to all the members of our panel from APPI Energy for presenting today's fantastic session, as well as all of our audience members, and most importantly, our member business owners that make NCIA's work possible each and every day. You'll be directed to a short 5-question attendee survey after leaving the meeting room. Please do complete that to provide us with some valuable insights to improve future programs. And then additionally, do note that all NCIA members receive exclusive 30-day access to all the formatted video recordings of our Industry Essentials educational webinars, first posted inside of our members-only community platform, NCIA Connect. Stay on the lookout for the Slack channel to be the first spot that link is posted on Friday afternoon. And then, as always, we'll leave you all with this end of event credit sequence, highlighting all of the 40+ member businesses that participated in this afternoon's session, alongside some lo-fi audio stylings by yours truly. If you don't see your company included, that means that you need to head to the cannabisindustry.org/join following today's session to join the movement for a responsible and equitable cannabis industry. Enjoy, and hopefully we'll see you again next week for another NCIA Industry Essentials educational webinar. We'll see you then. Thank you so much.